Hey everyone! I'm so glad you're here today for this special occasion. I am Sadie Hartmann, mother horror, co-owner of Nightworms, a horror subscription company dedicated to curating horror fiction and sending it to your door. I am also the author of 101 horror books to read before you're murdered,
Woo!
coming
Yes.
out in August. And it is my most happiest reader place vibes and love and everything to be here today with Josh Rountree, our special guest. He is the author of The Legend of Charlie Fish, which I have just recently read and need to talk about. And the reason for why we are here today, the release of this book here, The Massacre at Yellow Hill by C.S. Umble.
Unbelievable.
I'm so glad you guys are here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thanks so much for inviting me in to be a part of
Yeah,
it.
I mean, I'm so glad to have you two like together in the same room, so to speak, because we get to celebrate Seth's book, but also we get to just celebrate weird westerns, which it sounds like we're all huge fans.
Big fans, and I had an opportunity to read Seth's book. It was one that I really wanted to read, and I kept, kind of seeing it pop up on Twitter. I'm like, man, I've got to get that. I've got to get that. And then I looked a little closer, and I realized that a big portion of it was set in Big Spring, Texas, which is literally my hometown where I grew up. And I'm like, holy crap, I've got to get off my butt and do this. And so we started texting back and forth to each other, DMing, I guess, is what the kids say, back and forth.
That's what the cool kids say, yeah.
And found out that he's literally from Monahans, which is like, I don't know, 60, 70 miles away. So, we kind of come from the same place. So we quickly traded arcs, and I read that book in one sitting, and holy crap, it's amazing. You do want to get it.
I love that.
I appreciate that. That's very sweet of you to say.
No, man, I really loved it. And I have not had the privilege of reading books 2 and 3 yet, but I will be in line for those. So,
well, I appreciate that. So yeah, the Massacre at Yellow Hill is the first book in a trilogy that is complete. And just to let everyone know, the Massacre at Yellow Hill is the first book it's called That Light Sublime trilogy. It was originally called the Survivors trilogy, which really didn't work. As well as, because I called it the Survivors trilogy before I had written the third book. And so I guess as I was finishing the third book in the trilogy, I was like, we're going to have to change the name of the trilogy.
Oh, no. Okay. Spoiler alert. Not everyone survives.
That is correct. Not everybody survives in these books. But
it's a horror novel, so,
right. If it doesn't have a little bit of a body count, there's a problem. Right.
Really quickly, I just want to do some housekeeping. I'm seeing all these fun people over in the chat. So I just want to give a shout out to Paul Preston and Brad Proctor. Blue from Cemetery Dance is here. I saw LP Hernandez. Guys, thank you so much for showing up. I really want to turn up the party here because we get to talk about so many cool things. We have a great agenda for you today. First up, we're going to have a reading from Seth from his book. We're going to talk about Charlie Fish. We're going to talk about weird westerns. We're going to talk about all the OG Western writers that Seth and Josh just were talking about in the green room, and you guys really need to hear it. Josh has, a stack of books he wants to show off, including an old Joe Lansdale. And then I'm going to open it up for Q&A. So if you guys have questions for either of these authors or something dawns on you in the middle of when we're having a conversation, just put it in the chat there. I'm scrolling through it. I can highlight you guys. I can just pop something up there anytime. So make sure you guys drop your questions in there for the authors. But first, I do want to give Seth an opportunity to read to you from The Massacre at Yellow Hill.
Thank you so much, Sadie Hartmann, Mother Horror. Thank you again so much for hosting this. You are, in fact, the best. as we all know, the tastemaker of modern horror fiction. And again, before I do a reading, I want to express my gratitude to Josh for signing up to do this. I'm deeply appreciative. And I should tell people at the outset, Josh is, by my estimation, after having read The Legend of Charlie Fish, one of the best voices working in horror today. And I say that very careful. I use that phrase very carefully. And so, Josh, I really want to say thank you in being a part of our little party today.
Oh,
and
man,
hopefully,
I appreciate that. I'm just glad to be invited to the party. So thanks so much.
Yeah, of course. So I'm going to do a little bit of a reading from the very first chapter of The Massacre at Yellow Hill. And I hope that you enjoy it. I hope that you love it as much as I do. Chapter 1, Yellow Hill, Texas. Jeremiah Hart stood over the body, tracing his eyes over long crimson valleys. The deep punctures along the man's shoulder expanded down the stomach into ragged lines where a bulbous sac and purple intestines spilled out onto the parlor table. Hart let out a low hum through the folds of his frown. He closed his eyes. The well-greased cogs of his mind were spinning. His eyes opened, and he used them like a hammer, striking the three men who stood with wide-brim hats in hand, studying their boots on the opposite side of what was left of George Miller. "Foreman?" Hart said. "Yes, sir." Charlie Gaithers clenched every hole south of his belt. His knee was all twisted up and swollen. He felt some type of heavy pop in a joint while pulling George from the mine. That didn't matter now, though. What mattered was that Hart wasn't happy. Jobs would get cut, and heads would roll with them. "Please just fire me and let me go home," he thought. "First question." Hart's voice was flat and hard as a penny. "Why did you bring this man's body out of the mine without consulting me or Sheriff Bailey?" Charlie looked at Lucas Ramos to his right. The Mexican stared at his boot tips, silent. He swung his head left to mark Marple, who slumped at the shoulders, his hands behind the hat he held. "Foreman?" Hart said. Charlie's head quaked. Well, sir." He swallowed hard. "George here was still screaming when we was pulling him out, and he didn't stop hollering until we jerked him out of the shaft, and it's so dark down there. I don't think anyone saw how bad it was until we got him out into the light." "I did," Lucas said. "The hell you did. You couldn't see shit," Charlie cut in. Lucas shuffled his boots on the floor of Doc Cart's parlor, then said, I did, boss. George was trying to stuff his guts back into his belly." "Whatever he thought he saw, Mr. Hart," Charlie snapped. "The point is, George Miller was still alive after Mark here scared that thing off with his revolver. I just didn't think it was proper to leave a wounded man." "Didn't think it proper?" Hart said. Charlie wilted at the words. You jeopardized the entire operation. Months of work and tens of thousands of dollars pissed away because you were worried about what? Propriety? Your fucking manners?" Hart let the rebuke hang in the air. "You are the foreman. If you had the sense God gave a mule, you'd have left Miller at the teeth of this so-called wolf. Even a damn idiot knows that a man with his belly spilled open is a lost cause. You should have been securing the mine's safety instead. You stumbled out of the main shaft, breaking several lamps, which burned half a dozen men trying to get out behind you." "Mr. Hart?" "Subsequently," Hart said, his voice rising, "the fire caught a gas pocket," he was screaming now, "causing an explosion that caved in a third of our fucking progress." Charlie shook his head, unsure of himself, unsure of what to say. I just reacted, Mr. Hart." "I don't pay men to react, foreman. I pay some to dig and some to build, and just one fucking man out of 100 I pay to think, so that the others will have a singular voice of thoughtful command when things go to shit." "I'm sorry, Mr. Hart." "Charlie, your uncle was one of the best men I ever knew. In the 10 years he served as my foreman, not one single motherfucking problem darkened our progress," Hart said. Charlie knew that neither of those things was true. "You've been foreman for 3 months, and now here at my very goddamn feet I have a dead man, a whole mess of others burned to a crisp, and 2 months of work lost. And all you have to tell me is some bullshit story about seeing a wolf hiding in the mine. Whereupon, Instead of acting like men, you all shit your britches and cause the biggest mining catastrophe since, no, not since. It's the worst of all time. The worst fucking operating tragedy in the history of Yellow Hill. And then, surprising all of the room, including himself, Charlie said, all due respect, Mr. Hart, but it weren't no damn wolf in the mine. The boys who didn't see it said what happened. They called it a wolf, and I'm sure that's why you're doing it too. But that ain't what it was, sir. That ain't what it was at all. Hart's mouth hung open, tongue gliding over molars, furious. I grew up on a sheep farm, Mr. Hart, Charlie continued. And sir, I know what a wolf looks like in the dark. Hell, I know what it sounds like and how it acts. They don't hunt inside of mine, sir. They aren't that damn big, and they sure as shit don't do this to people. Hart lowered his voice. You do not want to be taking that tone with me. The soft, almost gentle tone beveled the edge of the warning. Charlie's brashness died a slow death in a long, quiet space after those words. Having cowed Charlie again, Hart offered, a bear then. Call it a bear. A bear? Charlie thought. There's not a chance in hell. Mark Marple finally spoke up. I don't reckon it a bar, sir. Hart squinted at Mark. A bar? A bar? What kind of accent is that? Charlie opened his mouth to answer. Wait, Hart said. I don't give a shit. He pointed a hard finger at Mark. Keep your mouth shut until you can learn to bend that German or Polish or whatever the fuck accent that is into something I can understand. Mark submitted, his eyes cowering to the baseboards. Foreman, you take these two men. You cover this body in a tarp and you take it out back to the barn. Then you go to the smith shop and borrow a few hammers, say it's for rock busting. Hart leaned forward, pressing his weight into the table. His knuckles creased white. Then you bust this man up until he looks like he was killed in the cave-in. And if I hear anything about a bear or a wolf, it'll be the three of you trying to swim in the river of shit that will follow. And that's a section from the first chapter of the Massacre at Yellow Hill.
All right.
Well Hope done. Everybody liked it.
Yes, according to the comments, you have people in there saying that you need to do all of your audiobooks.
Right. I hear you.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. That's very sweet of y'all to say.
I mean, I did like a whole like an audio book review on my Substack because I read this book. Well, I read it. I'll back up a little bit. I did read this book earlier. I've read the entire trilogy, actually. And then Cemetery Dance acquired it. And this is the first book. If you're just tuning in, this is the first book in that Light Sublime trilogy that Seth just read from. He edited this actually with Dark Heart editor Marissa Van Uden.
My favorite.
And so I really had to read this again because the teamwork between Seth and Marissa is really something special. And I knew that there was a lot of things that Seth, wanted to do with this first book that he didn't do when it was first published. So he has since really punched it up, I must say. And that reading was incredible.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, that was incredible. I did want to read like a tiny little part of my
please.
review. Okay, so I just want people to know this in particular, that I'm sorry, I just lost my place on here. So I want to tell people in my loudest voice possible that Umble's work is not only worth your time, it's worth prominent retail space on your shelves and worth opening your reader's heart. Because that, my friends, is where these characters will live in perpetuity. And I mean that when I say that. There are characters in this book in particular that will honestly live in your reader's heart, carry you through the trilogy, but then never leave. Like, they will be here. And actually, I read Josh Rountree's The Legend of Charlie Fish. Charlie Fish and Nellie are like right here too. I mean, I love all the characters in Josh's books, even the villain. But it's Charlie Fish is like right here. So anyway, I just wanted to say that these are two very special books, and I think that weird Westerns are very special, as you both were talking about, like the influences that people who have gone before you and written weird Westerns have had on you. So I just wanted to talk about that. Why do you think weird Westerns is having like a resurgence right now? And where have we been with weird Westerns, especially for you personally?
Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's, Westerns in general have always been my favorite book. So for me, that kind of stuff has lived with me for a really long time. Some of my earliest books I read were the like 60s and 70s paperback Louis L'Amour books, like with these kind of covers that my granddaddy would read and pass on to me. I probably read 100 of those before I was in high school. I mean, I just ran through those like crazy. But what I write is a lot of horror, fantasy, science fiction, just a little bit of everything. And so I've always tried to kind of incorporate different genres together, and I like reading that type of stuff. And so I think that's where weird Westerns kind of come into the fore. We talked about it offline, but I think the first weird Western that most of us read is The Gunslinger, the first Dark Tower book. But the first really weird Western I remember is Dead in the West by Joe Lansdale. And this is really awesome, like old 1990 copy of that thing. That's an author that I've always used as a great example for just the willingness to mix and match and put all of your flavors in one bowl and see how they work together. So I always love Joe's stuff, and I think he's really one of the ones that really brought that genre to the fore. But it's in the zeitgeist now, but it's certainly been there for readers who have sought it out. I mean, Sherry Priest has been writing weird Western
novels
years and years. Yep. Yeah, those are fantastic books. Emma Bull, The Territory is a fantastic retelling of basically the gunfight at the Old K Corral with a supernatural spin on it. So I mean, that stuff has been here. I think it's just you've kind of had to look for it a little bit more, and now there seems to be just an influx of it, from a lot of corners.
Yeah, absolutely. The first weird Western I ever got my hands on was the Jonah Hex comic book series that Joe in many ways is the reason that Jonah Hex is such a important figure in the DC canon. It represents a bridge in many ways from the Western becoming so popularized in the 1930s and 40s and 50s with the pulp trade paperbacks that Louis L'Amour was such a champion of. And his Haunted Mesa was the first weird Western novel that I ever read. And of course, there have been other writers like Jack Ketchum. A lot of people associate him with the girl, right? The Crossing, right? That's set in 1848 Arizona. I want to say.
I think that's right. It's been a while since I've read it, but it's man, that's a bloody book.
Right, it's very bloody. And the culmination of the weird Western might be, and this may be presumptuous, but it might be Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're looking at horror Westerns, that's the king of them all. I mean, anyone who doesn't consider that a horror, I don't know what to tell you. It's
the scariest book I've ever read, really.
It is a tremendously vicious novel that in a way that Cormac McCarthy, because it's really interesting. So there are these two pole points when it comes to the Western, and one is on the romantic side of things. It is Lonesome Dove. It is Larry McMurtry talking about, in a way, sort of a deconstruction of these character tropes of white hat wearing Texas Rangers who now in the sunset of their life are moving on this cattle drive, and the friendship that blossoms between all these characters, trying to, one of them simply, the most important one being Lori, trying to get to California and everything that happens to her. But it's this pure romanticism that sits right there where you can see all the color of a Texas sunset in it, with the velvety purples, the scarlets, the wildflower pinks. Like that's all there.
He's deconstructing the myth, but he's also still giving you like the panorama.
Absolutely. And with McCarthy on the other end, it is the deconstruction of the frontier myth by injecting a different, darker myth into it about the ablative destruction and eradication of the native peoples of the country, and the people doing that, their interaction with effectively the prophet of destruction of his time in Judge Holden. And a lot of weird Western fiction exists between these two pole points. And especially when we're talking about Joe, I really can't emphasize Joe's name enough in keeping weird Westerns afloat for so long. His ability to inject life and a no bullshit mentality into the way that people act in his stories, while also adding in all of sort of like 1960s and 70s Hammer film tropes, right? And so that's like, for me, that's, if you were to start a primer on the Western, I would start with Louis L'Amour, Larry McMurtry, Elmore Leonard, of course.
Elmer Kelton.
Yep, absolutely. And then I would throw it over, when you're ready to be done with the Western in any sense of romance, that's when you go read Blood Meridian, which is in many ways the Moby Dick of the modern era, intentionally so.
Like I'm a lifelong horror reader. It's the darkest book I've ever read in my life.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's just incredibly, you can't overstate, what a powerful novel that is. It's incredible.
Right.
I also just want to say that this isn't like Seth's book, The Massacre at Yellow Hill, and the trilogy itself is not a traditional standard fare for her Western. It definitely has supernatural elements in it. And there are creatures in it, obviously. If you look at the cover, which people were talking about over here, I do want to address this too. But if you look at the cover, this character here in the shadow, like when you buy this book, take a good look at what's going on there. I do want people to see what's like, take a good look. And Brad Proctor asked who did the cover. It looks great. And actually, he's here.
Francois! Unbelievable. So if I can for just a second, this is important. Francois has done a tremendous job. So Francois has finished all of the 3 covers for the books. He has done an incredible job of not only helping me see from an artistic vision of like where these things can go, and then taking notes for me, having to be like, hey, can this kind of be like this, or should this be like this? Francois has been a consummate professional, and I really appreciate everything he's done to make all of the covers what they are, because none of that is me, because I'm terrible at covers in terms of like, oh, we should do this, we should do that. I lean heavily on Francois and also on Sadie when considering like what will be a great cover. And that is all Francois through him or Kevin Lucia at Cemetery Dance being our go-between. So thank you so much, Francois. I appreciate it.
It's a really cool cover.
It is a really good cover. I love the silhouettes and I love the color work and everything to go with the title. It's really cool. But I also wanted to talk about, I wanted to get back to this really quick. I don't want to get distracted. Ross Jeffrey says, this guy is the writer I wish I was. So much time for such immeasurable talent. If you ain't reading him already, you ain't reading horror right.
Ross is just the sweetest. I appreciate that. Ross is just the sweetest. I encourage people. Ross has a book coming out called The Devil's Pocketbook. I definitely encourage you to pick that up. If you're looking for something in the vein of a series revolving around a small town, you should pick up his Juniper trilogy. Definitely suggest that for folks.
I agree. I've read Juniper and Tome, and I loved them both. And I I'm very excited to read the third book in that trilogy.
Wonderful.
So, yeah.
Thank you, Ross. You're very kind.
Really quick, we should talk about the fact that Seth and I did decide to read Charlie Fish, The Legend of Charlie Fish together. And I had a copy. I had a physical copy from Tachyon, but I gave it away because that's what you do to advance reading copies after you read them. Because if you love it, if you get an advanced reading copy, you read it, you loved it, you buy the physical copy when it comes out. That's the rule that I made for myself. It's a free copy, yeah, but it's not the copy that sits on my shelf. I go and buy the real one, put it on my shelf in my library, and then I pass the other one on to people who want to read it. So Nightworms, who is our host today, actually did this really cool giveaway on our Nightworms Instagram where we asked who had the most custom bookmarks that we include in our packages. And one of our lifetime customers who's been with us forever had every single custom bookmark that we've ever put in all of our packages. And so I put together a little gift bag for him and sent it to him, and I put Charlie Fish in there.
Cool.
Yeah, the copy that I read, because I know he's going to love it. But Seth, off the top of your head, like, what do you want to tell people? What do you want to tell horror readers about The Legend of Charlie Fish and why people need to buy it?
The Legend of Charlie Fish is the latest heir in what is a long history of storytelling through the American Western, which is in many ways one of the great American contributions to literature. It follows in the vein of great writers like Larry McMurtry, but more so those who have enjoyed the storytelling lilt of Charles Portis. People will know him from True Grit, which is his most famous novel. Josh manages with such a deft hand, I would say scalpel sharp deftness, that he is able to capture what is the most difficult element of Charles Portis's work, and that is the dialogue. The dialogue can do many different things when it is honed to such a succinct preciseness. Josh is able to convey both fear, humor, and bittersweetness, all within a series of paragraphs. And for those of you who are not writers, or I guess for those of you who are, you will understand the difficulty in mixing these ingredients together to create something that in the end reads consistently all throughout, to be able to put this sort of yeast inside of dough, and then over the course of the novel, see it rise, and not only rise well, but to brown on top. And then when you finally slice into the epilogue, everything that you have tasted before that moment will now be gauged by the taste of this. That's how good The Legend of Charlie Fish is. And I firmly believe in the quality of the novel so much that as a writer, when I was going through the book, I would look at what Josh was doing, and I would take notes on mechanics that I too want to get as good as Josh uses them. That's the quality of the novel, period.
Okay, so you heard Seth's take on it, and now you can hear a fangirl because he focuses on mechanics.
You're way too kind.
No, I'm not, Josh. I'm not.
Like we didn't mention Charles Portis when we were talking about great Western writers, but True Grit is one of the best novel I've ever read. And yeah,
100%.
The dialogue that dude writes. I mean, what always blew me away is when you start connecting the dots. The movie basically pulls dialogue straight out of the book. It's so good, and it's not how, it's kind of that writer thing of, it's not how people actually speak, but it still works, because that's how they should speak in the book. So,
right.
Yeah, I have a question about that, but I also just want to say, like, when I was reading it, I would just talk to Seth and be like, Charlie Fish. Like, I mean, for all the readers out there who just love quirkiness and sweet characters with like a stout heart and just an imagination that can bring a character like Charlie Fish to the page and then bring it into my mind as like a little movie character, like it's like part Black Lagoon, Creature from the Black Lagoon, and part like The Shape of Water, and the whole trope of like a surly man who adopts like some orphans and goes on kind of a journey, and they encounter all these like characters along the way. It has that whole trope in it, which is like one of my favorite. Actually, Seth has the same thing. Seth has a surly guy who has adopted an orphan and is teaching him like these life lessons. Like, oh, I could just read that forever. Like, that is so many Westerns. Like True Grit has the same thing where it's just like, I just want to live in that trope for the rest of my life. Like that's what I was saying, is like just props to authors. I can't get into the mechanics of what you guys are doing. You guys see behind the veil like that. But as a reader, it's just like, I just eat it like food.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
It's always amazing to me that anybody reads anything when it gets, you write something and it goes out into the world, and it's always mind blowing to me.
Right.
I'm sure that's like the weirdest part of the experience. I mean, just to pour into something and then watch readers enjoy it must be just the best. That's probably why you guys do what you do. It
is both the best and the worst. The Massacre Yellow Hill actually has one of my favorite reader reviews of all time, where a woman says, I started reading this book and then they started using bad language and it immediately turned me off. And then there's supposed to be something about vampires. I guess you should buy this book if you're into weird, dark things. 1 star.
And everyone's
there's your the next edition. There's your cover pull. I guess
right. That's the cover pull. Right. That's the top end blurb.
Yep.
Right.
I love that. What I wanted to ask you guys about dialogue when you were talking about that, when you're writing, do you guys talk about that out loud? Like, do you talk for your characters out loud to hear how they're saying something?
Yeah. So I do. It's a trick that I learned and I can't even believe I didn't mention Robert E. Howard as one of the great horror and weird Western writers of all time. Robert E. Howard, with his Elkins. I can't remember the first name of the character. But anyway, Robert E. Howard had this trick where he would, after he got done with the first, or while he was doing the drafting, when a character started talking, Robert E. Howard would do the dialogue out loud to make sure that it sounded the right way that it needed to sound, so that his neighbors would sometimes ask his mother, who was Bob in an argument with last night? Because, he's sitting there screaming Conan lines of dialogue about murdering wizards, and all this stuff. So it isn't, I would say that for every writer who is either learning or trying to perfect their particular dialogue style, speaking it out loud in the fashion of kind of like doing the author reading that I just did, you should always be able to feel the emotion in the words. And if you can't feel them, then you need to revise to make sure that the exact impression that you want comes forth. What do you think, Josh? What about for you?
Same type of I don't read it out loud, but I definitely work a lot on the dialogue passages, and it gets kind of in the weeds with the writing process. But I can almost get to where I can feel just by the shape of the dialogue on the page and where like the little interstitial bits are of what the dialogue tags are doing and that kind of thing. Like if it's actually going to flow the way that I want it to. I don't read it out loud to myself, but I definitely kind of play that little scene out in my head. Like, okay, if this was like a movie scene happening, how would this be going? And usually as you kind of read through that, you can feel the missteps and you can go, okay, right here, I don't know what this is, but it needs something. I mean, you had, maybe a little bit more salt here, whatever that is. And I think that's one of the hardest things about writing for me is I can always tell if something is wrong, or something needs to be added, but sometimes it's hard to figure out what it is that has to be added. But you get that little spidey sense in certain places, and I think that's what I do when I'm kind of working through my dialogue.
Right, especially in terms of like if you've built up a character over a couple of chapters and you kind of have a notion for what their voice is, you can start to sense in certain places if you're doing your first draft, you can be writing dialogue back and forth, and all of a sudden these two characters start to sound a little bit too much alike because you're technically having a conversation with yourself. But the higher version of that is being able to feel the scene as you're drafting it, seeing it in your head, see what the characters are doing with their tics, and then their dialogue will flow out of that. But I mean, that's I don't want to say a high-end mechanic, but being able to see it as you draft it is, I think it's a measure of capability. At least it is for me. Most of the time,
the dialogue needs to be doing more than just having characters talk to each other.
Right.
Like you put those lines in there that maybe they're saying something to the reader that the characters don't necessarily know. Like it could be something in the way they're saying it as a threat, but the characters don't necessarily pick up on that. But as a reader, you absolutely know that's happening.
Right.
Or the character does know it, and it just is said in such a way that it's like, oh, that's kind of ominous. So.
Right. And if you're trying to hone your dialogue, I always advise people to go and look at Quentin Tarantino's best work, because what Tarantino is able to do with dialogue is he's able to do two things. One, he lifts the tension very quickly in a scene. Like it can go from 0 to 100. And he also raises and lowers power dynamics and which character is in control of the conversation just based upon what the people are saying. And that's always going to be valuable for a writer to be able to say, well, this guy was in control of the conversation, but this one made a point that's a valid point, and now this other person is on the defensive. Well, what are they like when they're defensive? Do they get angry? Do they get submissive? And then the character starts to take shape, and then over time, once you get into the flow of things, those characters start making decisions that the writer doesn't really have a whole lot of control over at that point. The train's out of the station. So
yeah, and it's funny that you can come at it from a lot of different influences. Like Charlie Fish is definitely me trying to channel Charles Portis with the every bit of it, including the dialogue, but it's also me trying to channel Raising Arizona. I mean, really, if you look at like the dialogue of that movie, I love it so much. And, some of the lighter parts, I can kind of read through my own work and see that stuff, kind of coming into the picture there. So
I could totally see that. Yeah, I can totally see that.
I worked in a video store for a long time, and I've seen that movie at least 100 times.
There's this scene I wanted to say about for Seth. There's characters who are saying things, but they're also doing things, which is really important, because if we are being visual readers, which I am, like it's cinematically playing like a little movie in my mind, I need those cues of what the characters are doing, like while they're talking. They're not just standing there like in a video game where it's like, burp, 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 burp. Like they're rolling cigarettes, they're picking lint off their clothes, they're brushing a horse, they're walking in a bar, they're scanning around, looking at shit, they're nervous, they're, all of that helps the movie to flow while the dialogue is happening. And Seth does that really well. They're making coffee and doing all this stuff. But and in Charlie Fish, there's this crazy scene that happens when they first happen upon Charlie Fish. They see him for the first time, and these two like really, questionable people are doing something to him, and they happen upon this scene. And from the beginning of when that happens to the end of where that is, like one of the most cinematic scenes I've ever read. Like I saw everything from what Hank, is that his name, the little boy?
Yeah.
Hank.
From what Hank does to what Nellie says and how she treats the situation. I mean, she's definitely in control for most of that whole
Kentucky Jim, the professor.
Well, and that's another piece that comes in. So the dialogue there is I think it's me trying to do Connie Willis. who is a fantastic writer, particularly of short stories, but novels as well. And she has this brilliant thing where she's able to have has, you know, a half dozen characters or so in dialogue, and they're having conversations over one another, but they just kind of do this. And so somebody's responding to this person responding, and she's just brilliant at doing that. And so I think, you know, that's something that I strive to be able to do, but it's hard.
It was great.
I love that. That's great. Seth's book actually kicks off like a whole year of horror Westerns and weird Westerns coming out. I just wanted to kind of like, actually it was in April, Pandy Press put out The Survival of Margaret Thomas. And that's by Del Howison. And that's a really great horror Western if you guys want to check that out.
Absolutely. I can't wait to check that one out. Yeah,
that came out in April. And then Death's Head Press has Hot Iron and Cold Blood, which is a whole like anthology. And then their Splatterpunk series is returning with a Chad Lutzke release. Haley Piper has one. The sequel to Magpie Coffin by Wiley E. Young called For a Few Souls More is coming out. Lone Women by
Victor Laval, one of the greats.
Yeah, was that earlier this month?
It was earlier this month. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so it was earlier this month. And that, talk about your supernatural, cool, like strong female protagonist. Like that one has the whole picture.
He's an amazing writer. I bought it and I intended to start reading it this weekend. I got sidetracked, but it's like right at the top of my to be read pile.
Yeah, good. Yeah, everyone should definitely check that out. That is definitely going on my stack of books for this year. Red Rabbit is coming out from Alex Grecian, which is Tor Nightfire release, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
And then When the Night Bells Ring by Joe Kaplan, Melinda West Monster Gunslinger. That's Casey Griffant, I think is her last name. If I'm saying that wrong, I'm sorry. But yeah, just what do you guys think is going on here? There's this huge resurgence of weird Westerns. Like, what's in the water?
I think that there was and Josh, interrupt me if you disagree. There was a point in the American culture when people were still in love with the Western. They loved the idea of the American frontier, which has always been singularly at the heart of the American character, that's manifested in both frontierism, which is a very, not expansionism. It's a different thing. So there are these two poles, right? There's exploration, which we love, and the people who do it, and especially in cultures where there is a mounted hero. There's always on horseback, for the Japanese, it's samurai. For the European, it was the knight. For Americans, it was the cowboy. The cowboy represents our history of that. And so all these books came out, and then and with the rise of cinema, John Ford Western, Sam Peckinpah, Sergio Leone, there's this massive influx of different types of Westerns. And then it all culminates in the 1980s and early 90s. In fiction, it happened with Lonesome Dove, which won the Pulitzer Prize. And then Cormac McCarthy hits us with Blood Meridian. And then, there it is. That's the version I have too.
That's an OG first print, buddy.
That's the OG. And so then Clint Eastwood decides to do the ultimate deconstruction Western in Unforgiven, which both it unravels the mythology, and then at the very end of the film builds the mythology all back up in the final sequence.
Is that the best Western ever? Because I think it probably is.
Lonesome Dove is the best Western ever made.
Okay,
I'll die on that hill.
Even the television adaptation. I mean, I love it, but yeah.
Yeah, I will. For me, pound for pound, Lonesome Dove, the miniseries, is greater than Unforgiven. Nobody gets to shoot me because of that opinion.
I have not read Lonesome Dove.
It's
I
fine.
It's like 800-page book that you can just lose your life in.
Right.
And it breaks so many storytelling rules. Like you're like 300 or 400 pages into it, and then it goes to a completely separate group of characters and hangs out with them for a while, and you don't exactly know how what's happening, but you just kind of trust the narrative, and it just works.
Right.
I like that.
And I think that what's happening now is there's been enough time of the Western being in the burial tomb for finally people to be able to say, like, come out, Lazarus, like, wake up. And I think that's what's happening. Like, I believe there's a certain element of our character, of our culture that wants to aspire, and I shouldn't say aspire, but wants to believe. And in many ways, that's what writers do. They provide readers an opportunity to believe in something. And with what I was trying to do with that Light Sublime is to bring back what Larry McMurtry gave us in Lonesome Dove. And because I deeply believe in that type of storytelling, which is one of the things that I do in the trilogy, is I do that trick that McMurtry does, where I jump right to a completely different place and you don't know how those characters are going to meet up. But they do.
It was wonderful. And, to the earlier point, I just, the narrative was so strong that I just trusted that it was going to come back together, and certainly it did. So,
well, I appreciate that. I think people want to find a little bit of romanticism in what is effectively the most cynical epoch, however you want to say it, in our modern period. And the West allows us to do that. We can look at the dark mythology of things, and we can find that even in the light of a black star, there is a ray of hope. So, but I mean, that's my thought. What do you think, Josh? Or go ahead, Sadie. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say, in your book, Seth, there are relationships in the Massacre at Yellow Hill that are going to carry throughout the trilogy. And they are people that readers can invest in and fall in love with. They're not just like, sometimes in horror, I feel like some of the outlying characters are just there for the slaughter, where it's just
Right.
like, why should I even bother to learn these people's names? They're just going to have one line of dialogue and then they're going to, which is fine. But there needs to be some sort of like investment for readers in order for us to care what happens to them. So you have this father and son duo of Gilbert and Carson. You have the Miller family. You have Tabitha, who is recently widowed, and her children, Annie and Georgie. Georgie, yeah. Look at me. I'm remembering names.
Incredible. Unbelievable.
Yeah. So it's really important for people to realize that, like, this isn't horror, and this isn't Western in the sense that they're one or the other. It's kind of like these books, Charlie Fish and Massacre, are incorporating other genres as well, like romance, and the vampire element, but also like the whimsical and the dark fantasy of Charlie Fish. Like, they're just stories. We don't have to pigeonhole them and have an expectation. They're just stories where you can fall in love.
Right. And
be terrified.
And be terrified, right. And so I am happy to let people know that we say that it's a trilogy, but the entire trilogy is done, and they're all three published this year. So The Massacre Yellow Hill is out now. A Red Winter in the West comes out in July. I'm working again with Marissa Van Uden, who is my favorite editor, on both of those. And then The Light of a Black Star, which I just now realized that I plugged and didn't realize I had just said that, but The Light of a Black Star comes out in November, culminating the entire trilogy. So I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, lots to look forward to.
Awesome.
And when does Charlie Fish come out?
July 25th.
I always say Charlie Fish, but it's The Legend of
Charlie. The Legend of Charlie Fish. Right.
And the cover is very epic. It looks very Western to me, with the gold and the.
Yeah, that's a John Coulthard cover, and it's pretty rad.
Yeah,
so you have Charlie Fish kind of smoking his,
Charlie Fish
in the middle, and
wearing his long johns, smoking a cigarette, bleeding bleeding, but not bleeding, Bleed, bleeding, BLEATING.
Bleating like a lamb.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if anybody has any questions, we're probably going to wrap up the party, but I did want to give an opportunity for anybody. I was kind of keeping an eye on that. There was lots of celebration and lots of like, I want to buy this book, which is great. We love that. Paul
Please
Preston, he's going to take a copy. So, but if there's any questions, like now is the time. Otherwise, I just wanted to make sure that you guys know how much I appreciate the work that you do in keeping readers entertained and keeping our hearts full of characters. I had somebody ask me, like, you fall in love with characters all the time. Like, do you ever forget about them, or did it ever feel like it's too much? No, it's never too much. A reader's heart is like enormous, and I can stuff them all in there and carry them around with me. So I appreciate that you guys have added to my little reader collection in there.
Well, so as always, I of course want to thank Sadie for providing us the platform to be able to come out and talk about come out. We're not headed anywhere.
Come out to this place.
Joseph Wilkinson asked, will there be audiobooks? So I'll let everybody in on a little secret. Ever since I wrote these books, I've had one audiobook narrator in mind. And that's the guy who did George R.R. Martin's Fever Dream. And he is just, he was also on Game of Thrones. I'm forgetting his name now, which I feel terribly embarrassed about. Ron Donahue is his name. And I've always wanted Ron Donahue to do the audiobooks for these because I fell in love with him in his version of Fever Dream, which I listen to at least 3 or 4 times a year, is how much I love it. Ron Donahue costs a lot of money. And so let's go out there. Let's buy those books. Let's get on the Ron Donahue train so I can hire Ron Donahue to do it. So. Yeah, that's what I would love to do. But I do appreciate everybody saying I should do it. That's very sweet.
You could do it.
That's true. I mean, I do the audiobooks for the Dark Heart books, the Blackwell series. Well, Sarah, I could listen to you read out loud all day too.
We will definitely be back for the Legend of Charlie Fish.
Absolutely.
That release. We could totally do a party and talk about that some more. I would love to do that. And also, since Seth, since your second book is coming out in July and so does Charlie Fish, we could just meet up again.
Yeah, I would love to do that.
Promote the books again. Yeah, so much fun. Okay. I think that's all the time that we have for today. And just want to thank everybody for showing up and having a party with us. And Seth, we just wish you all the best with the trilogy and especially with the Massacre at Yellow Hill. We hope everybody buys a copy. Will you be selling signed copies, actually? I'm going to be selling signed copies as soon as I get them in the mail. And so I'll be letting people know that I will be signing copies as soon as I can. And will you announce that on Twitter or something? Yeah, everybody can, you can look out for that kind of announcement and all of the other crap that I put on Twitter daily, which are usually like writing warm-ups that I do or sections from books, trying to get people interested. But you can find me at CSHumble, CSHUMBLE, like the personality trait, at Twitter. So okay, so you're on Twitter, you're on Instagram. I'm on the Insta. I'm on the Facebook. Insta and Twitter. Mm-hmm. But miss me with that TikTok bullshit. Yeah. Josh, what about you? What's your Twitter handle? It is Josh_Rountree, and there is no D in Rountree. No D in the Rountree. Like Roundtree, but without a D. So just like there's no H in humble, it's humble. Mm-hmm. Well, it's the H is silent. We're the exact opposite of each other. Okay. Right. All right. Well, thanks again. You guys stay put. I'm going to let the audience go ahead and check out of their little party time. And yeah, thanks again for joining us today. Thanks, everybody. Bye.